Would you mind introducing yourself?
Sure. My name is Jessica Hua. I am an associate professor at Binghamton University.
Thank you. And could you tell us a little bit about your research?
Sure. So, my lab is interested in understanding how pollutants and a wide range of pollutants, from pesticides to road salts to light pollution and microplastics, how these pollutants influence aquatic ecosystems.
Wow, that's a lot. Have you found anything that you think would sort of surprise or interest people?
Sure. At the moment, we are working on an experiment with microplastics, and one of the directions and the questions we're asking is how might microplastics influence host parasite interactions? So, not just what microplastics do to a particular organism, but how might it disrupt interactions between multiple organisms? And this is work done by my PhD student, Nicholas Buss, and he recently found that microplastics in the water column can actually reduce parasitic infection in tadpoles. So these microplastics are floating around, and these parasites are trying to swim around in the water column to find their host, the tadpole. And we think what's happening is these microplastics are getting in the way of the parasites, making it harder for them to locate a host and then successfully encyst and infect that host. So that's one of the more recent papers that is coming out of my lab. We sort of look at the effects of pollutants from two perspectives. One, what are the ecological effects, which I just described? How might pollutants alter those interactions between hosts and parasites, competitors, etc.? And then the other direction is, what about the evolutionary effects? Pollutants can cause selection on populations. So we work on the evolution of pesticide tolerance in these wildlife populations. And we're really interested in that because if these populations are able to evolve tolerance to these pollutants, then they may be able to persist even in the face of chemicals in their environment. But of course, we link it back to the ecology because if they're evolving tolerance to chemicals, what are the costs of that? How might that then have cascading consequences on things like disease susceptibility? So it's
Wow.
sort of a link between ecology and evolution,
Mm-hmm.
and then a strong arm of outreach because we firmly believe that if we can't communicate this research to broader audiences, then really what is the point of doing the research? And to do this, we do a lot of integration of art, technology to try to find ways of better communicating our work. I had an artist in the lab I had mentioned before,
Mm-hmm.
Ben. He put together a children's book and on parasites because he wanted to teach third graders about what parasites were, why they were important in the environment. And then he used that book to teach teachers how to teach third graders. And then they brought in, I think it was about 590 third graders to our partner, a museum, where they then got to interact with a lot of the members of that book or the characters of that book. So tadpoles, parasites, a lot of the animals you
A
see in
lot
the
of
back.
those guys back there. That's so cool. I actually have, with all that stuff you just said, I have a few questions.
Oh,
But
great.
one burning question I have is, what's the name of that book?
Ah,
Let's
Gemma
see.
Jones.
Gemma Jones, and let's see.
Nuthatch.
Nuthatch Hollow, a wetland adventure.
Yeah.
Sweet.
So
And so
it's,
that's just a published book that people could find and read and get.
yeah, we have it on our webpage, and if anybody's interested, it's paired with a lesson plan
Mm-hmm.
that is matched with New York standards, learning standards, so that it's meant to make it a little bit easier for teachers to implement. And we have a handful of those. We have one on ponds, we have one on backyards, one on forests and meadows, and it was done in collaboration with Roberson Museum and Science Center.
That's really awesome. Um, I'm definitely going to have to check out those books.
Cool. Yeah, I'd be happy to send you a copy.
Oh, wonderful. And now, going back to something a little bit more about the actual science. So, you mentioned that the microplastics, your PhD student found that they might be sort of interfering with parasites parasitizing tadpoles. And I am just wondering, because I think some people might be like, oh, wow, that's great, because parasites are bad. When you hear that, is that what you think, like scientifically? Oh man, parasites are bad. That must be great.
Such a great question because actually, when we were assessing the effect of our outreach, one of our questions was, are parasites bad? And that was one of the things that we really wanted to convey to our students because parasites are an important member of the community. And one example of that are, let's say, damselflies. They actually consume quite a bit of parasites. So if you take the parasites out of the water, that's a food source that they may not have. And so, in terms of are parasites bad, perhaps they may have negative effects on tadpole hosts. But I think looking at the bigger perspective, it's almost a philosophical question: is something bad or good? It's more of just an important piece of the ecosystem. These parasites are really unique because they have a really complex life cycle. So the stage that we studied, it infects the tadpole. But that parasite then needs to be consumed by a bird or a mammal. And then in the gut of the bird or mammal, they reproduce sexually to produce eggs. And those eggs then go back into the wetland and the eggs hatch and infect a snail. And then it's a snail that then they shed those cercaria that infect the tadpole. So it's a what we call a dose dependent parasite because if they were to kill their tadpole host, they wouldn't make it to the next stage. And so it's a very fine balance between how many parasites, if the tadpole is infected by too many parasites, the tadpole will die, and potentially the parasites also within that depend on the tadpole host will die. So it's a fairly important balance, and we can think a little bit about the pollutants, right? Do pollutants disrupt that balance? Do pollutants make tadpoles more susceptible to the parasite? And then what are some of the cascading consequences there? So it's a long-winded answer to it's hard to say whether preventing parasites from infecting tadpoles is a bad or a good thing. This was a relatively short-term study, but I think that the main takeaway is that pollutants in the water can disrupt these host-parasite interactions. Microplastics can disrupt it, and this is one of the first studies or the earlier studies that have considered not just what pollutants these microplastics do, but how they affect interactions.
Right. And it sounds like one of the takeaways might be that one thing that we change as people in the environment could have really unexpected and surprising consequences.
Yeah, that is very, very true, and we've seen it in many of our studies. For instance, my other graduate student, Grayson, she works on light pollution, and she showed that just right now, light pollution can affect the level of predation, so the susceptibility of a tadpole to its predators. So, and it's not just the fact that there is light making the tadpoles more visible to their predators, but early exposure during the embryonic stage can have lasting consequences on their susceptibility to predation in later scenarios, whether the light pollution is present or absent. So it really does matter. And there's also a time scale associated with it that we should consider.
So the time scale being like, are they exposed for a long time or a short time?
Yeah, or just when are they exposed? Like as embryos, as eggs, why does it matter that they're exposed to light that early? And then how does that then have cascading effects later in life when they're tadpoles? So
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. And I think to me, it's especially interesting because we think of light as being so innocuous. Like maybe it wakes you up, but then you can go back to sleep, but it's not like a chemical.
right.
But maybe it's more powerful than we imagine sometimes.
Yeah, and what she's looking at is that these lights can trigger changes in circadian rhythm, which can then have cascading consequences on other areas, such as their ability to camouflage themselves, their ability to metabolize their stress levels. So she's really looking at this from an ecological perspective and looking at just multiple species to see if they vary in their responses. And I think like something that is very important is thinking about early exposure. We looked at this in pesticides, and we actually found that early exposure to low levels, so environmentally relevant concentrations of a pesticide, allowed tadpoles to become more tolerant to that pesticide later in life. So, in their early stage, if they're exposed to pesticides, it actually allows them to be more tolerant than their brothers and sisters that were not exposed to pesticides early in life. So there's an ability to rapidly respond to pollutants in the environment within a single life stage. So it's I think within a single lifespan. So I think there's a lot to learn from this idea of early exposure and what consequences might happen later in life.
Wow, that's really fascinating. Um,
Really excited about that one.
yeah, I can see why. Because I mean, not only is it very interesting, like why and how, but it's also a little bit optimistic. If it gives a hint that some creatures might be able to adapt, but then how much?
Yeah, and that's the really interesting thing about the evolution side of our research, right? They may be able to adapt, but it's all about resource allocation. If you're shunting resources towards responding to the pesticides, what goes? And
Mm-hmm.
that's where we're looking at next. Does it affect their ability to deal with then parasites or enemies in their environment?
Mm-hmm.
And so we're really interested in that disruption of balance.
Wow. So it sounds like you suspect that any adaptation that is helpful could come with a trade-off.
We would expect that, and we do see some of that when it comes to the strategy that these tadpoles use to deal with pesticides.
Mm-hmm.
Some of them are tolerant all the time. We call that constitutive tolerance. Some of them are plastic, meaning they only turn on their plasticity or turn on their tolerance when they need it. And you can imagine that these different strategies might lead to different types of costs. Because if you only turn it on when you need it, then the rest of the time you might have resources to deal with enemies, etc., like pathogens. And so we've shown that these different strategies can lead to different susceptibilities to parasites like the trematode or viruses like ranavirus.
Wow. So I am wondering, so for the program that we're making this video for, teachers are going to be taking their students out into wetlands. Some will go to ponds or streams. Some might go to a river. They'll go to all different kinds of environments, but they're going to be going and looking and seeing what they find. And I wonder if there's anything you would suggest that teachers and students keep an eye out for.
Yeah, I think we actually have a lesson plan for that. If you're at all interested,
Oh,
we
you are prepared.
this is something that is important to me because I didn't start off like I didn't start off interested in the outdoors and the field. It took an experience like this to get me excited about this direction. I'm from an immigrant family who's like outdoors, no, stay away. So we have one part of the CIWS that I direct. It's actually meant for students to go out with their teachers to
Mm-hmm.
sample wetlands, and it has a few activities in there about the importance of wetlands and how they can soak up pollutants and what diversity you might find. I can definitely share that with you if you're interested.
Oh, that
Um,
would be really wonderful. And so it sounds
yeah.
like one of the things that you would suggest they keep an eye out for is just the incredible biodiversity that you can find even in, like, I hate to use the word, but an ordinary wetland. That
Yeah.
place that you're like, oh, that's not special. It's behind my school. You could still find amazing diversity there.
It's without question, depending on when you go out, all you need is a small net, and you just dip net, and there'll be a number of insects, amphibians if it's a particular pond without fish. You'll see damselflies, larval dragonflies, larval damselflies, insects like zooplankton or insects like you might have diving beetles, back swimmers. Some things may bite, but you I think it's easy to put them into a sorting tray to be able to see them.
Hmm.
Um, yeah, no, there's so much. You can almost guarantee that if you sample in the right location, there'll be tons of organisms to see.
Yeah, I think that sounds very exciting. That makes me want to go out and sample something right now, right?
You have
Um,
to leave to pay me to do this.
I know you really you figured out a good job for yourself.
Oh,
Um,
so lucky.
so I think you've talked about this a little bit, but I want to ask more specifically. So the environments that you study, do you are there any challenges that they're facing that really stand out to you?
Yeah, so wetlands are threatened, and amphibians in particular are threatened by a wide range of human activities from habitat loss to emerging infectious diseases to pollutants. And one of the challenges with thinking about these systems is that they're often interacting
Hmm.
these stressors. So you have pollutants that are interacting with diseases that are interacting with invasive species, and then habitats are being destroyed, and then that's cutting off populations from where they need to breed. And so amphibians are worldwide are undergoing massive declines. And so this is something that we are particularly interested in understanding because what are driving these declines, and what can we do to help protect and to conserve these populations worldwide? It's a difficult question,
Hmm.
but I think there are a great diversity of different scientists attacking this question from different angles. We're part of the Amphibian Conservation Action Plan,
Hmm.
and what we're trying to do here is to put together sort of a guide for scientists and then a guide for the general public for how we might and what are the challenges and what we need to do to move forward to protect these populations and these amphibians in general.
Yeah, actually, no, I've heard that amphibians worldwide are really suffering. Are amphibians in New York State also suffering in the same way?
As far as I know, not in the same way as throughout the globe.
Hmm.
The populations that I work with, wood frogs, are still fairly abundant. That's not to say that they face a lot of threats, but amphibians are generally quite sensitive to a lot of changes, including pollutants. So oftentimes people like to suggest that they are one of the first species or first groups to go,
Hmm.
and so that's why they serve as a good indicator of the health of an ecosystem or a watershed. And so, from what I've seen, there are threats in our area with global change in particular. These amphibians, at least the early breeding amphibians, they're often these what they call the false springs.
Hmm.
So it'll be warm, and these amphibians are cued by the warm weather. So they'll come out, they'll breed, and then they'll be faced with a winter storm. And that winter storm will then decimate some of their eggs. So that's one threat. The use of road salts. There's a researcher in Connecticut, Steve Brady, and also Rick Relier at RPI, who study the impacts of salt as well. And this is another major impact because these amphibians aren't well suited to osmoregulate in salty environments. So are they declining? They're probably threatened, but I don't personally have evidence of populations declining in our area.
Right. So that means perhaps they're not declining so severely that you can just see it without doing a specific study to investigate it. It's not it's not that kind of massive crash that some parts of the world have seen.
Yeah, in the amphibian species that I work with, we don't see that massive crash.
Well, that's
Some of my
good.
colleagues working in Central America, they certainly see that loss of amphibian diversity. And it's again a mixture of multiple stressors that combine to almost create this like perfect storm of the threats that these amphibians have to deal with.
Yeah. Now, one of the things I want to ask you about, you just started to talk about, which was climate change.
Mhm.
And you mentioned that because the springs are getting more irregular, I guess, and you get these things where it feels like a summer day, but then, 3 days later you have a foot of snow. That's really hard for breeding amphibians. Are there any other effects of climate change that you've been noticing?
Um, in my lab in particular, we've studied the effect of cold temperatures
Mm-hmm.
on amphibians. So what happens if you're just raised in a cold temperature versus a fluctuating temperature versus a constant warmer temperature? And what we've shown is that the cold temperature, the constant cold temperature, as eggs, made tadpoles more susceptible to parasites later in life. And so when it comes to global climate change, we're interested in shifts in mean temperatures, so it's expected to get warmer, but also what we expect is increased variability. And so one of those consequences of variability is that these amphibians may be exposed to these short periods of cold. So these short periods of cold, what do they do later in their lives, and does it have an impact? And that's primarily where we have begun to study the effects of climate change. We're starting to think a little bit about how warming temperatures influence feeding and metabolism, but that's slated for this summer's work. So I have a new master's student that is interested in that question.
Mm-hmm.
I know a lot of folks that are interested in warming temperatures. My former undergraduate student Paradise is now at Purdue University, and she's interested in looking at how warming temperatures can alter host parasite interactions.
Yeah, so it sounds like there's a lot of research being done, but we don't have all the answers yet.
Yeah, that's it seems like that's a continuing theme in science. There's so many questions, and every time you answer a question, it opens doors to new questions. And I think hopefully that with all these different pieces of a really well done science, we can begin to draw generalizations about what we might expect climate change to do to amphibian communities and populations. And the cool thing is that you can look at it from every level of organization, from like the individual level all the way up to the community, the ecosystem level. And so you might think about how temperature affects the ability of a tadpole to defend itself against a parasite or a pollutant. But then at the community level, you might think about how rising temperatures might change the community to make a more competitive environment, because if it's warmer, maybe more amphibians will all breed together at the same time, and that might increase diversity at any given point. And then if you have more diversity and more competition, how might that then change disease transmission, or the ability to be stressed with competition, and to also manage pollutants in the environment? So it's really fun and exciting to think about how all the complexities can fit together when we're thinking about just how humans are changing the environment for organisms.
Yeah, something you keep mentioning is your students do a lot of research. And I know one of the most surprising things that I found out when I started to learn about how science is done is how much science is done by students and how young a lot of people are when they make scientific discoveries.
Yeah, I'm biased, but my students are incredible. I have currently five graduate students, and six undergraduate students, and they care so deeply about the research. They do really good science, but again, they care about what they're doing, and so they're very motivated to communicate that research to people that are beyond the ivory tower.
Mm-hmm.
And so when it comes to a PhD program, my philosophy is these are the interests of the lab. And I am your advisor, and I will do whatever it takes to make sure that you ask good questions and you design good experiments so that we can gain understanding by the end of it. But these students, they work together, they come up with really ambitious experiments, but because of the culture of the lab, people jump in. Like this weekend, we somebody had an experiment that like all of a sudden needed to be moved. There were 8 people that came in to help move this experiment over to make sure that it started at the right time point. And when you work with animals, you can never tell when anything, you can't plan for anything. And so, yeah, we have a really fantastic group that is just, they're so passionate, and it's been like, I think that's the best part of my job, probably, to be able to interact with them and to put good science out from, and also like they're going to be the next generation of scientists that move on to whatever direction that they can positively impact with whatever experience they learn here.
Yeah, that sounds really exciting. So I have a question for you, which might be really hard. I don't know. So if a group of middle schoolers or a group of high schoolers or, a group of younger students than who you usually work with, if they are studying their local environment and they're likely to discover some problems that are things that they would like to, have a really positive impact on. Do you have any ideas about what some middle or high school students, what they might do in their communities to make, to kind of make things better for the local wetlands and ponds and streams and for their watershed in general?
Yeah, that's a great question. The first thing that comes to mind is that there are no limits to who can make a difference. I do think that like citizen science is something that has so much potential. It's a win-win, right? Scientists can only study a small area, and we're limited by resources. But if we get the public interested in asking these same questions, then all of a sudden the scope and the ability to look for generalization expands. And so I think the most important thing with citizen science is just what is the question? And so once the question is clear, then we can properly collect the data that will help us to actually answer the question. We do this, we're planning this for third graders. One of the questions we're asking is, why are some communities more susceptible to diseases than others? And what we're going to do is we're going to generate content using technology, art, working with our collaborators at the PBS, the local PBS channel, to teach these third graders how to dip net, how to sample. And then that data is actually going to go into some of the research that we're doing. And it's super nice because, like I said, we can't physically, my team can't get out there to sample all of these ponds. But these third graders, if properly trained, and we intend to make sure through our resources that they have the ability to do the same things. Ecology is not hard. It's really just about the questions you're asking and the techniques to answer them. So there are many citizen scientist programs. There, one that I know off the top of my head, it's amphibian call monitoring program. And so people can learn how to recognize calls, and they can go out at night and basically help survey a pond. What is there? When are they there? And that data goes directly to the groups that run that. There are groups that look at birds. We're going to be doing there are programs like BioBlitzes, where the community can come in and help us identify organisms that live in watersheds. So it's lots of different ways that people can get involved. What can they do? I think it's important, similar to what the philosophy we have in our lab. Sure, you get the details and you get the information, but what is the next step? How do you then communicate that? And I think there are plenty of ways to do that, from things like science fairs to social media has been an incredible tool. That my students now prefer TikTok, which I'm learning more about that as these platforms are changing. Instagram, they'll post things like cleanups or group data collection. So there's a lot of opportunity now for people to get involved in many different ways, regardless of what stage they're in.
Right. That makes a lot of sense. And I like the two big ideas there, which are you can help with research, even if you're not a professional scientist, in a really
Mhm.
meaningful way. And you can also get the word out so people know what's happening and what's important.
Yeah, what is a scientist anyway? I
That's a
think
good
that's
question.
something, yeah, that's something that I talk with my students about. Like, why do they not see themselves as scientists? They're going to get a degree in biology. They are literally going to exit this university as a scientist. Yet that perception isn't there yet. And I think that's one of the challenges, right? Like scientists shouldn't be this unattainable. It's just a way to look at the world and ask questions and answer our questions in a systematic way. And I think
Hmm.
anybody can do that.
Right. I think that makes sense. And I think, it's something where we can think of ourselves as being an artist if we just do art. So is the barrier for entry in science any different? Like if we just do some science, does that mean we get to be a scientist?
Yeah, and my advisor always said that. Yeah, you can. You're a scientist when you ask the questions to the scientist and you get the information out. I think the key is you must get the information out, otherwise it's a hobby. And then maybe perhaps it's the same thing as art. You can be an artist, but I don't know. I guess that's an interesting question that I haven't had a chance to think about. What makes you an artist? Somebody that just does art, or somebody that does something with the art post the art? And it's the same with the scientist. You can do science, but what makes you the scientist is when you publish or you communicate your work to broader audiences. And I'm not sure.
There may not be a clear cut answer. Um, Now, something you've mentioned a few times is you're the director, I think, for the Center for Integrated Watershed Studies. And
Mhm.
it sounds like that group does a lot with the community. Is there anything you want people to know about that?
Yeah, we are undergoing a revamping of the center right now. It's our missions are to do science in watershed and protecting watersheds and also educating. So they're the two components there. We are going to be our flagship program is going to be that BioBlitz. So we're starting a new here now to bring people into the community to do that BioBlitz. And so I just took over the reins last semester, and we're really excited that the diversity of scientists here range from environmental chemists to geologists to ecologists. We have expertise in forests, in wetlands, in streams, and so there's so much potential there. We are sort of trying to figuring out who we are now. And with me as the director, obviously education is really important. So you can imagine us as there's a core education where each of us brings our expertise and we can communicate that to the broader audiences. But on the periphery, we also work together to answer broad questions. And because we are so interdisciplinary, we are able to answer these questions from a unique perspective, from multiple perspectives. And in that way, we hope to better address and push forward the protection of watersheds.
That sounds wonderful. And so,
Yeah, I'm
if
excited.
I mean, I can see why. It's very exciting. So, if teachers are doing a big watershed project, they could contact this center and maybe get a classroom speaker or something like that.
Absolutely. We have graduate students, we have undergraduate students, we have faculty members that are all involved in this, are very active in this center, and we can tailor needs to whatever classroom. And we have undergrads or graduate students who have done Skype a Scientist. So many of them already have watershed talks ready to go if timing is short.
Well, that's always handy. Yeah.
Yeah.
So, is there anything else you want to sort of get out to teachers who might be watching?
I think the one thing is please reach out if there are any specifics that you think we can help with, especially as the director of the Center of Integrated Watershed Studies. We have resources. We just don't know very well how to best um, put those resources out and whether those resources are resources that might be useful. I can share things like lesson plans, and from our perspective, fundamentally, we just want to get that education out as much as we can. So if there are any ideas and directions, we're always interested in hearing them.
Well, I'm definitely going to follow up with you about getting those lesson plans and making them accessible to the teachers who take this program, because I think that's to have a lesson plan that has been sort of approved by some scientists. That gives a lot of credibility. Like, yes, this is scientifically accurate and important. Like, that's wonderful.
And if it helps too, it was looked over by BOCES. Because I don't have the education expertise. And so we had the other side come in to help us make sure that it actually met the standards.
Even better.
I hope.
Yes. So I want to say thank you so much. This has been really helpful.